And yeah, I think if we see the student visa fee come to a far more reasonable amount, whether it's back to the $710 or to an $850 or even to $1,000, I think we'd see the market respond quite quickly. And if you look around the world, the key competitor nations for English language, not particularly enticing for English language students.
G'day and welcome to Global Horizons. I'm your host, Rob Malicki. Not coming to you from Sydney today. I'm coming to you from the other side of the world in Paris, France, where it is like a bazillion degrees and summer has set in. And Dirk Mulder, good to have you join me from closer to home, but you're not at home either.
I'm not, Rob. I'm down in Wurundjeri Country down in Melbourne and enjoying it.
Yeah, except from what we were talking about just before we jumped on and started to record, you've got an interesting drive back to Sydney tomorrow from what you were saying.
Yeah, so I drove down last week. Had a number of meetings down here. It's been fantastic, and for all those that had the time to spare to meet with me, thank you very much. Finished up today with another 2 meetings, which has been great. But yeah, tomorrow I drove back. There looks like there's a bit of weather sitting off the coast, so which I believe is just starting to come in, and I think Sydney's had it hit in the last sort of 12 hours or so.
Yeah, Sydney does look. We've been following the radar from here in France, and it's just been crazy. Just like big white. I was going to say white out, but it's not quite right. Like green out of rainfall. It just makes me cross my fingers that I closed all the windows before I left home.
Well, I mean, as an aside, I actually went to school in Goulburn in New South Wales, and for the first time in a long time, I actually took the bypass on the way down, and it was -7 in the morning. It was crazy.
-7.
Yeah, so there's definitely
that's brutal.
Definitely been a bit of weather going on.
Yeah, there we go. Well, with that said, let's jump into some of the news. There's been some good stuff going on. All right, well, let's get into the news then, Dirk, and maybe we start with the Lowy Institute poll, which has just come out.
That's right, Rob. So, as you mentioned, the Lowy Institute put out a poll. Not the first poll, so it's actually a number of polls, I guess, in a continuing sequence. So it's always good to get a longitudinal view of attitudes around things. This poll, I guess, it was more encompassing, but Tracy Harris wrote this one up, and she concentrated on the international education part of it and around Australians' views, and I'd say Australians, you can determine that how you like, views around international students. And interestingly enough, while we've probably just been through an election cycle, and while many in the sector would have thought that those views have changed, it turns out that since the last poll in 2020, things haven't changed that much. So the 2025 poll found that 42% of respondents think the number of international students enrolled in Australian universities is too high. But that compares to 43% in 2020. So not much has changed, mate. When we think about those attitudes and we think about the view around social license, it seems like we've been on the wrong path for quite some time, or not much has changed, and there seems to be just the dialogue around it has changed. So interesting results.
Isn't that funny? Like all of that dog whistling last year from government and opposition around migrants and university students stealing our accommodation actually had no bearing whatsoever on those kind of numbers.
Certainly not through this poll. So yeah, it is interesting, and hopefully that rises to, I guess, some of the narrative that's been going on and settles down some of that narrative. But we'll see what happens. I mean, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 6 months.
I think it's curious that it suggests it's like an entrenched view, doesn't it? And that it's a sort of view that's you're either entrenched one way or the other, which in some ways is good. It means all of that kind of negativity that we had last year essentially didn't have any major impact. But it also means that the scale of the job, 42%, is still quite a large number. People thinking that those numbers are too high.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, it needs some addressing too. It's interesting. Speaking of data, maybe that's a good point to move on to the really lovely piece of work put out by StudyMove earlier. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to say earlier in the week. That's the thing. I'm jet lagged, mate. I'm on the other side of the world. It feels like it was earlier this week. It was actually last week. StudyMove annual data analysis, their key data uptake. This is a great piece of work. Talk us through some of the findings. Couldn't
agree with you more. I mean, I think we've spruiked Kerry and Dimity's work for quite some time, but again, delivers really, really well. Look, again, a comprehensive study. The headline, I guess, is that StudyMove's predicting a 5 to 10% decrease in international student commencements in 25 compared to 2024. So I want to say that this is kind of big news. I want to say it's not big news too, because I don't think anyone's been kind of out there predicting anything. It's all been a watch and see kind of mentality. This, to my mind, and I might be wrong, correct me if I am, but this is probably the first time that I've seen someone actually put a number on it. So it'll be interesting to see how things go over the next little bit. But certainly a 5 to 10% decrease is what StudyMove is saying. And look, I think you sat on that for a little bit before you left, didn't you? So you probably have some better insights on what I do. But yeah, certainly from the data that was presented at the end of it, that's the headline.
Yeah, look, I really enjoyed it. Like, what I love about these guys is they do this kind of mix of proprietary research and public domain research, and you get these insights that you simply just don't get anywhere else. So I love the work. One of the things that I found fascinating in this piece of work, and I might reach out to Kerry to see if he'd give me permission to share this slide in the podcast. So if you're watching this along in video, hopefully I'll be able to put the slide up. But he was talking about, like, they've done some research around public university revenue and expenses. And essentially, when you look at this chart, it's a kind of line rising to the right, as you would expect, in terms of both revenue and expenses. So revenues going up from 2002 right through to sort of the pandemic, revenues increasing kind of in a fairly straight linear fashion, and expenses underneath that also rising in a fairly straight linear fashion. So they're sort of tracking side by side and growing. Fantastic. But since 2020, no surprises, there's been this incredible volatility in both revenue and expenses. And I think this was kind of like the crux of the session, is that whereas life pre-pandemic was kind of getting fairly predictable for most of institutions, growth was happening in different areas, whether that's research, international students and the like, and the expenses, also fairly predictable. Since then, things have just become chaotic. And I'm sure for our colleagues working inside institutions, that's maybe not a surprise, because we've certainly seen the road bumps. But of course, the difficulty that this creates for institutions is that it makes the planning for the future just incredibly difficult. And so Kerry's session covered a whole bunch of the reasons behind that volatility, and also some of the things that institutions could be doing to work to this new normal, I suppose you would say, because it doesn't feel like with the current policy settings or the current global conditions that things are settling down anytime soon.
You know what? I think you bang on with that. And I'm assuming there's a recording available out there somewhere, but I'm going to go one further. What do you reckon we try and get Kerry on and we actually have a chat with him about it?
I would love to have Kerry Ramirez on.
Yeah, if you're listening, we want you on the podcast.
The shout out is there, Kerry. Open door for you to walk through anytime that you want to. Well, talking about the future, Dirk, you sat down recently with Phil Honeywood, CEO of IEAA, International Education Association of Australia. Of course, was on the podcast with us recently, but you had a good chat with him. So what came out of that conversation?
Yeah, look, I did, Rob. And again, I look straight up, I say thank you to Phil for his time and his open candor as always. Phil's been a big supporter of the podcast and a big supporter of the Quail News, so I do want to acknowledge that. Yeah, so look, sitting down with him, I think there's a number of things. I mean, look, we're about to hit, I guess, the new government the new parliament sitting. I think the 22nd of July is their first sitting date. That means that the new ministries are well entrenched now. We know that there's been conversations going on with Minister Clare and Assistant Minister Hill. So we're now starting to see, I guess, what the policy forum will look like or the policy direction will look like over the next 6 months. So Phil was really, really quite good and open and gave me, a lot of perspective around what we can expect over the next little bit. So the first, I guess, point is, and for those listening, we're pre-recording. This will be released on Friday. We're now Tuesday, the 1st of July. There was a meeting earlier today, and we don't know the outcomes of that as yet, of the major peak bodies. So, and the peaks were discussing a number of items. And so the first one, I guess, is what Phil spoke to us about on the last podcast, which is the ELICOS sector. And we've got Ian Ed on a little bit later. So I'll be really interested to see how Ian talks about that. And for those listening, that was actually pre-recorded prior to Rob leaving for France. So we won't have the outcomes of today's meeting, but we'll certainly have a perspective around how ELICOS has suffered through the visa charges going up. So again, just to be really clear, the first item on the agenda is about how do we deconstruct the visa fee in a way which supports shorter-term courses, and I say that purposefully. So within that blanket at the moment, we can talk about the ELICOS, the entire ELICOS sector. We can talk about non-award study, so study abroad and other areas that might fit within that. And we can talk about a third sector, which I think is probably a little bit more, I don't want to use the word contentious, but certainly a little bit more up for debate, which is around vet programs that might be less than 12 months. And I think that's probably an area that has a little bit more discussion to it rather than the first two. I think the first two are, most people will say, are no-brainers, and I think the last one may have a little bit more teeth with the government. But certainly that visa fee and how that might look will be on the table. Given the fact that today is the day that the fee went up from $1,600 to $2,000, we know that that's been baked into the budget. So there's had a lot of work done in the background to offset what those budget ramifications or the forward projections on those budgets might be around visas across the sector. So that would have been on the table today as well. So a really big day for the peaks around that visa. And let's hope, as Phil stresses, and as I think, for the want of a better word, Blind Freddie could tell, if we can be unified in that position as a sector, that's going to be a much stronger position moving forward than if we are not. And we know how I shouldn't say the government, but we know how deunification can lead to poorer outcomes when it comes to lobbying. So it's really important that we are on the same page, and hopefully today's meeting got to that. Other issues that we can expect to come up, and again, would have been discussed today, but if not, we know are on the agenda. So the first is the NOSC allocation model. We know that we're probably going through a period now where the government needs to set that for the next 12 months now. So the initial one was for the first 12 months. We now need to start thinking about what's going to happen for the next 12 months, 2026. And that needs to be put in place fairly shortly to give institutions certainty about what to do around 2026. So there's a couple of issues.
Dirk, for those people who aren't familiar with it, if you're a new listener of the podcast or new to the news, the NOSC is the new overseas student commencement. So it's everything we were talking about last year in terms of capping international student numbers and making sure that institutions know what their allocation is.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that, Rob. Well, sure, I probably should have been a little bit more simplistic in that.
Well, mate, you spent 12 months writing about it. So.
I know. Sometimes it just, the acronyms just come off the tongue, right? And how uncommon is that for this sector? So there's got to be a review of that. And I think there's probably fair to say that in the haste in rolling that out, there's probably some tweaks that can be made to that allocation methodology. And so there's probably a bit around that. And I'm probably being fairly... Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just laughing because methodology just made me think of the RoboCap stuff like all from last year. It's assumed that there was a smart, intelligent, methodical way that was worked out.
Let me be as politically correct as possible. So that's the first issue. How can we make that methodology as tight as possible?
An actual methodology. Yeah.
And the second one around that is there's going to be some institutions that I'm certainly aware of, and I don't want to name them just yet, but there's some institutions that may have a significant amount of unused allocation. And is there a redistribution model that has been thought up of for that? Or what might happen in a case where an institution may have unused allocations? Will they be redistributed across the system either in the current year or the following year, or how might that work out? So I think there's probably a couple of discussions around that.
Actually, there's something interesting just on that one, mate. There was something interesting in Kerry's presentation from last week where he was talking about the two different types of institutions in that regard. Like you've got the institutions that have growth potential because they have space within their caps to grow. And then you have growth constrained institutions, and how they're going to be two very different approaches for those institutions. Obviously, growth potential institutions are going to be looking to maximize conversions, get more students in the door. Those ones that are constrained have a different set of priorities now, which is really about maximizing revenue, trying to make sure that they're working efficiently and operating as best they can because they're hitting their caps. So I just think that's another interesting observation, sector-wide.
No, 100%. And then the last issue, I guess, that Phil really tabled was around, if you remember back to the ESOS Amendment Bill, or the Education Services for Overseas Students Amendment Quality and Integrity Bill 2024, the one that was shot down by the Liberals at the last minute, there were probably, if I can say, there were two major components to that. So one was around the allocations, or at that point, hard caps, and that probably took most of the oxygen in the room around the Senate hearings. But there were a whole bunch of other integrity measures that were built into that. Now, depending on who you talk to across the sector, I think that those integrity measures as a suite are probably put into a couple of different camps. So one is, yes, there's some solid thinking around we need enhanced integrity measures. The second camp is probably acknowledging that that's a true statement, but the way in which the bill was constructed was extremely poor and led to outcomes that would not necessarily enhance those statements. And then the third, which I think the government potentially wants to push, is, well, we need to just get those back up again. So I think there is a genuine push from the government to increase integrity through the ESOS bill. I hope that we have a process put in place now, or a process will be put in place where we can talk about what those integrity measures be from a top line viewpoint, and then we start looking at how do we construct changes to the legislative instrument which will actually engage those changes in a meaningful way, as opposed to what we saw previously. And I think so that process, I think, is starting now, and Phil probably flagged that that's at the beginning point right now. But certainly from what I gather, Assistant Minister Hill has certainly put integrity measures on the table. But let's hope we can restart a new process to look at integrity in a way which has meaningful effect for the regulators to ensure that we do have a much better sector moving forward, as opposed to penalising, the entire sector for the wrongdoings of a small few. And what we should be doing is looking at giving the regulators the tools that they need to weed out the bad eggs.
Yeah, and I guess that's maybe the advantage of this thumping Labor election victory back in March, is that it gives them the clear air without the politics sitting behind it to actually do what they would like to think they should have done to begin with, which is consult widely, figure out what the real problems are, and go and solve those problems with the scalpel, not with the mallet.
100%.
So
100%.
We see that. We'll bring in our guest Ian Aird in just a moment, but before we do, a bit of good news from sunny southeast Queensland.
Yeah. So up on the Sunshine Coast, University of Sunshine Coast put out a release not long ago and congratulating a research assistant there, Olivia Herman. Congratulations, Olivia. Been announced as Australia's nominee for the United Nations Esteemed Young Scientist Award under the UNESCO Man and Biosphere Program. So it's great to see. The comment that I would make, and I hope this is taken in the right vein, is when you see a lot of these nominations come through, they're generally from the same institutions. So it's wonderful to see the University of Sunshine Coast research assistant become Australia's nominee in this space. So congratulations to Olivia, and congratulations to the University of Sunshine Coast. We wish you all the very best in the award judging, and fingers crossed we can announce a big win later on.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
And without further ado,
you can't afford to miss the Australian International Education Conference, happening the 14th to 17th October at the National Convention Centre in Canberra. AIE sees the place to meet over 1,500 international education delegates from Australia and overseas. Build your own learning schedule, gain insights from sector experts, new research findings, and spark ideas at lively discussion sessions. Plus, there's plenty of networking opportunities, from the expo hall to brain dates and social events. Don't miss out. Make sure you're at AIEC 2025. Registration is open now. Learn more at aiec.idp.com.
should we bring in our guest?
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. Let's do it. Mate, it's really, really great to have Ian Aird join us. Now, Ian Aird is the CEO of English Australia. He's been in the role we were just talking about it, but roughly about a year and a half, give or take a few months. Welcome, Ian. Great to have you on board.
Thanks, Dirk. Thanks, Rob. Lovely to be here.
I mentioned that you've been in the role about a year and a half. We generally like to start off with a bit of a backstory. So how does one become the CEO of a peak body, and particularly one which is a very specialty peak body, looking after the Ellicott sector in English Australia?
I'll speak to my story. I don't know if we can draw any conclusions about how one becomes a CEO of a peak body. I've only done it once. So, look, I've been in the international ed sector for a bit over 25 years, and the vast majority of that's been in the English language sector. I got involved with English Australia about 15 years ago when I was GM of a member college, and, got involved in the branch meetings and the conference and so on, and met all the people. And then I joined the board of directors and sat on that for about 3.5 years. That was back when Sue Blundell was exec director. Then I left the college space and started a consulting operation, and that was about the same time that Brett Blacker came on as CEO, and English Australia became a client almost straight away. And I did, I was lucky enough to do a whole range of different jobs with Brett, from, data research projects to legislative change work, advocacy stuff. I facilitated the strategic planning processes for a few of the 3-year plans and so on. So I was always in the background. Then COVID came along, and strangely enough, I decided that consulting wasn't really happening. So that was about 5 years. So I left the consulting after about 5 years, sort of mid-COVID, came back into the college space, took over an Ellicott college, and and rejoined the English Australia board. And then after about another 3 years, I was deputy chair at the time. Brett stepped down, and a number of others gave me a little nudge to give the role a shot, and I did. And here we are. It's an incredible privilege. I mean, I love the sector. I love ELICOS. I love the work that English Australia does and has done for more than 40 years, and incredibly lucky to have such an amazing job.
Sorry, can I just jump down a little side note for those people who are listening along? Like, if you look back, like that moment where you're like, I'm going to get involved with my peak body, and holy smoke, like, years later, you're now the CEO. Isn't that something for people who are early in their career that they should, like, get involved? Go and get involved in these things.
Oh, 100%. 100%. And I think really what led me to this role was literally that, getting involved. I put my hand up for pretty much everything, got involved in whatever projects I could. I don't sleep a lot. I was always busy, always offering additional help and so on, and learnt that I loved it. And yeah, here we are. Wouldn't have happened without that.
Boom.
That's amazing. So you've been in the role a year and a half now. From the outside looking in, is the role different to what you imagined prior to applying for it? I mean, given that you've had the experience in the background, sort of sitting behind Brett for a while and whatnot, you probably had a fairly good view. But what are the things that have really either sparked your interest, made your eyes open, dropped your tongue, whatever it might be? Can you point to a couple of things that may be a bit different to what you first anticipated coming into the role?
I think it's pretty similar to what I expected, but just far more all-encompassing. There's a lot more to juggle. So when I was on the outside, I would contribute, help out with this project, help out with that project, contribute to the various advocacy or legislative change issues and so on. But there's a very big difference between the intellectual process and thinking things through and coming up with ideas, and then actually navigating and negotiating those across what's a pretty diverse membership base, and in what have been some pretty challenging times for the sector at large, and very much for ELICOS. It's been pretty non-stop since I stepped into the role. I think the big policy shift sort of started right pretty much smack bang when I started in the role. It's been drinking from the fire hose ever since. In terms of surprises, I think I'm positively by how amazing this sector is. I mean, as I say, I've always loved the ELICOS sector, and I've loved it because of the people in it. But the level of support that I've had in the role, not just from my board, who are an amazing selection of people who volunteer an incredible amount of time to the association and to the sector, from the members, from individual members, but also from outside that. The other peak body heads, Felix at ITECA, Phil at IEAA, Luke at University of Australia, have been incredibly supportive and helpful. I mean, they've all, seasoned advocacy and government professionals, and, my background is more in the college space. So, they've been incredibly generous and supportive. Brett always making himself available to help me out with some history and I've got a very good mate at the koala who's always there to share a word of wisdom when I'm walking a tightrope or two. So yeah, there's been a lot of that sort of pleasant surprise. I expected it would be a positive environment, but didn't expect to be sort of supported quite so much, which is really, really lovely. And I guess on the negative side, I've been surprised by how far we've gone into the space where, the sector is being, really badly damaged. And it surprises me that we've gone quite so far down this path.
Let's talk about that more, mate. What obviously, I've read a few things of late, and obviously I write things myself, but, the key viewpoints are some of the English language changes early on probably didn't help. Fast forward a little bit, but really the hammer was probably the English visa, the student visa fee going up, and particularly for shorter programs around that. I do note that there's some advocacy going on at the moment to try and split that up. But how would you describe, I don't want to say the demise, but the change around all of this and where the sector sits currently? Yeah,
look, I mean, I think it pays to put it all into a broader context as well, because the broader context, I really think, speaks to the dramaticness, if that's a word, I can make that word up, of the situation. In that, I mean, if you go back, we had 10 years of steady, stable growth, and I mean, nearly 20 years if you ignore the sort of 2009-10 sort of dip, which didn't damage ELICOS as badly as it did other parts of the sector. But, it was an incredibly stable steady growth through the industry. And then along came COVID. Now, where the other sectors sort of went online and were delivering to students offshore, et cetera, Ellicott has always been a classroom situation. And so, within 3 to 4 months, we'd dropped by 90% of our students. Massive numbers of people were no longer working. It was pretty decimated, and it was staggering how much fortitude, but also investment people in the sector put into their businesses to keep them afloat. Because at the end of COVID, there were a handful of businesses that were gone, handful of colleges and organizations that were gone, but most were still around. And then we went through breakneck growth through late 22 and 23. I mean, the college I ran, we went from the beginning of 22 to the end of 23. We grew 14 times. It was breakneck. We grew to larger than we had been previously, but it was just the Ellicott students they come all the time. They can start any Monday, they can finish any Friday. So we respond to these shocks quite quickly, and we grow back quite quickly, or at least we did when everyone was still standing at the end of COVID. And so, there was that sudden growth, and then we hit 24 and a sudden decline again, and that kind of roller coaster is just so damaging for an organization where, you've got some heavy investment. You've got campus, which is an enormous investment to manage, and the quality businesses have big investments in their operations, teams that, take a long time to build and so on. So, and Ellicott is very labor intensive. So, that's been quite dramatic too, in that as the size goes up and down very quickly, staff come in and out. Where we are right now, it's staggering to believe, but the visas for Ellicott only, which is about 40% of the Ellicott sector. So Ellicott only visas are just the ones just doing Ellicott. Traditionally, that's about 30 to 40%, and the rest are doing pathways. But it's always been a good a good indicator of the health of the Ellicott sector. Those volumes for the applications and the grants at all-time lows in terms of the records that we have. So they're lower than the numbers back in 2005. So that's pretty devastating, particularly on a human level, where we've got, I would suggest, several thousand people have lost their jobs over the last 18 months, having, lots of them been back into the sector in 22 and 23. And we've seen some really painful losses of colleges. And just last week, we lost Perth International College of English, PICE, over in WA. And that was a pretty painful one to see go. He's been around for 23 years. He was a board member. John Paxton, I'm talking about, was a board member of English Australia and has been, championing quality in the Ellicott sector for 30 years. So it's a really sad day when it happens.
You know what that makes me think? It makes me think of, like a building or a bridge or something. And, when it's built, it's kind of designed to withstand changes in conditions. It expands and it contracts and things like that. But, expands too much, or it contracts too much, and the cracks start to appear, and it almost feels like this. It's been pushed so hard through these different circumstances that those cracks, you get to a point where you've either got to fix them, aka government stepping in and helping the sector, or they just kind of keep pushing it more and more, and things will start to break. And I just feel like this is the situation we've ended up in with like these. I'm going to call it like terrible government priorities. That just, the sector needs help not to be pushed even further to the brink.
Yeah, look, I think the English language sector in Australia is far smaller than the university sector and the vocational sector. It's quite different. And from the perspective of the average person, but also the average person in Canberra, they have no experience of an English language classroom. Lots of them have gone to TAFE or a vocational training college. Lots of them have gone to university, so they get those sectors really well. But very few people have been a language learner who's traveled the world and learnt a language in another country. That's an unusual thing for us Aussies to do. And so it's a little bit foreign to a lot of people, and it often gets misunderstood or forgotten about, which is a real shame because it is a really important part of the foundation for the university sector and the vocational sector. I think that, we've got research, and I'm trying to put together an in-depth research project, but we've got anecdotal research and research from individual providers, which shows that the students who do an English language program in Australia have significantly better course outcomes and life outcomes when they go on to university study or vocational study. They pass more often, they fail less often, they're retained more often, and they have better well-being. I mean, when they come into the English language sector, because they're in the classroom every day for a good solid chunk of the day, they build social networks. They've got a lot of person-to-person support with their accommodation, with their life, etc., with their mental health. And it just sets that foundation that you don't get if you come in straight into a degree program. Even if you do have the English language capability, you don't get that sort of soft landing, as we call it.
There's been a time of conditioning take place, if you can put it that way. There's familiarisation.
Confidence and skills, yeah.
With life, the pedagogy here in Australia, all of those things, there's been time to familiarise with. So it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I do think that, as I say, the English language sector often gets forgotten about in these big policy moves. And I think that was the case in this situation. I've certainly been pleased by the conversations I've had so far. So I've already met with the new Assistant Minister for International Ed, Julian Hill, and I was really pleased with that conversation, that there was a genuine concern for the English language sector. And it does strike me as, we are a small sector, and the government felt that they needed to do things with respect to the higher education space and the vocational space. And, to some extent, we got caught in the crossfire. And I have been pleased with, as I say, the conversations and the actions I've seen since the election to support the English language sector as a valuable and valued part of the economy, but also part of the social landscape and part of the educational landscape. So, positive signs.
That's good. Mate, touching on the visa fee issue, where are we at with that, and what can we expect over the next couple of months?
Well, English Australia's been advocating for ELICOS to have a more proportionate fee since when we had the first increase. $1,600 is probably not that big a deal if you're spending 50 to 80 to 100 grand on a degree, but when you're spending $5,000 12-week English course or $8,000 on a 20-week English course, it's a big impost, particularly when approval rates are at record lows and people are struggling to understand those approval rates. I think there's a lot of concern around the transparency and fairness of visa outcomes, application outcomes. And so when you go then to $2,000, it's just getting a little bit in the absurd space, particularly if you're from a lot of countries where they have, at the moment, some quite low grant rates. And they don't seem to be able to, despite significant effort, don't seem to be able to crack the nut on how to get around those just yet, how to, get those applications through. So we've been advocating for quite some time to see the rate lowered. That's hit some challenges in terms of, the single visa, single fee thing. Government seems to have managed to find their way around the fact that, for any single visa, they can only charge one fee. They've found their way around that technically now.
Don't they have different fees for different countries though? Isn't Timor-Leste?
They do now, that's right. So if you're from Timor-Leste or from Pacific Islands, those people were getting a rebate, which was a massive challenge for the department and logistically not very sustainable, but they managed to make some system changes now. And so it is possible to charge differentiated amounts. And so, as I say, I've been pleased that there has been a recognition that this is a reasonable thing to do from government. And so they are exploring it. Obviously, it's challenging when they make an announcement around visa fees in connection to a budget, and then you get all the budget legalities and challenges. And so timing will be a problem because really we need it to happen yesterday. But I'm hopeful that we'll see some improvement in that space at some point in the not too distant future.
Well, sounds like it's something to look forward to.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously what government does is what government chooses and decides is best and most appropriate. But we need to stay hopeful because $2,000, I think that the sector is seriously challenged from a sustainability perspective.
As someone who's not come through that part of the sector, what's this sort of average pipeline for an ELICOS student? Is it something that if these settings corrected, that we're going to see a relatively quick bounce back? Or is it still quite a long pipeline for your average student?
It's dramatically shorter than it would be for a university student. Students choosing a 4-year study program that, really contributes to their career and life and so on. It's a huge decision. Whereas, there are students all around the world who know that they need better English to have a good career, but also to travel, to explore. It's a really easy thing for them to decide, yes, I need better English, because if I'm going to work in an international company, they're going to want it, they're going to appreciate it. Might not pay me now, but it will as I move up the corporate chain or whatever it might be. So the other thing is that the average English language course is around 18 weeks on a student visa. And so, you're talking about an investment of sort of $5,000 to $8,000 for a course. It's a big deal, but it's not, investing $80,000 in a master's degree in a particular area. So the pipeline is dramatically shorter. And I think if we see the student visa fee come to a far more reasonable amount, whether it's back to the $710 or to an $850 or even to $1,000, I think we'd see the market respond quite quickly. And if you look around the world, the key competitor nations for English language, not particularly enticing for English language students. I mean, the US is certainly, probably the US and Canada are most similar in demographic to the kind of students that come to Australia for English language study. And both of them are seriously struggling with student visas and other issues. And so, there are a lot of students who want to come to Australia and study English.
We'll hopefully see some changes on the visa fee front over the next, hopefully month or two with an announcement, and then who knows what may come from that. But let's fast forward, and this is always the final question that we ask our guests. Fast forward, say, 2 to 3 years, and you're looking back. What are you seeing from Ian Aird's perspective? Are you seeing a return to normal for international education, or are we walking down a different path?
Yeah, look, I don't believe in the concept of a return to normal. I think that the world's always moving forward. It's that, you never step into the same river twice kind of deal. But I do hope that in 2-3 years, we're looking back and we're seeing what was a dip. It was a period of learning about how the sector can be better supported and better understood, particularly by those in Canberra in policy roles and in legislative roles. I hope we look back and think how, while it was a painful period, it was a valuable learning process, and that there's a new era of consultative, genuine listening to the voices in the sector. That's what I hope to look back on. I don't really want to think about the alternative, to be honest. I'd hate to look back on a sector that that was a valuable contributor to our education space, that made us friends around the world, that made our tourists welcome in pretty much every country around the world. People who speak English and have traveled in, studied in, loved Australia. I think if we don't get it right soon, and we're already hearing from colleagues in the tourism sector and the hospitality sector, because the English language sector is pretty integrated, very integrated, I should say, into tourism, into hospitality. English language students, a solid chunk of them come and they have a great time. They travel, they play, they explore, and that's very much to Australia's benefit, not just theirs. So, I think that if we don't get it right, we're going to start seeing the damage done across far broader than just the English language sector. But, as I say, let's stay hopeful. We'll be looking back, and we'll be thanking ourselves for the efforts that we put in, praising our own resilience, and looking at the fact that we learnt a lot and we've come through it stronger.
Ian, they great insights, and I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you very much for coming on, and we hope, if it's okay with you, to maybe have you on again sometime soon.
That'd be great. I'd love to be back.
Awesome.
Great to spend some time with you both.
Thanks very much, Ian. And for all of you listening along, of course, thekoalanews.com is your source of everything to do with international education in Australia and beyond. If you're not yet a subscriber, then jump onto the website now and sign up. Dirk, as always, great to chat, and see you in the next news episode in a couple of weeks' time.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Rob.
If you've enjoyed this episode of the Global Horizons podcast, consider subscribing to our newsletter. Search for Global Horizons podcast and then just pop in your email address, and that way you will never miss out on all of the critical international education news that you need to stay up to date with. This episode has been produced on Gadigal land in Sydney. Our video and audio editor is Len Zamora, and I'm your host, Rob Malicki. Have an awesome day. See you in the next episode.